Hello grade 4 students. Do you remember these two images? The panther chameleon and the agama. We have learned about how they use different adaptations to survive in their environment. Agama hide in shady areas in deserts, like between rocks or in the holes, to get protected from heat, which is one of its behavioral adaptation. What about the panther chameleon? The panther chameleon lives in savanna forest, and we observed how it reacts in danger as it puffs up its body with air. Then it opens its mouth wide to look frightening and drives away predators, which is another example of behavioral adaptation. Today we will talk about plant adaptation. Do you remember the previous lesson's question? It was, do plants, like animals, have behavioral adaptations? That's what we are about to discover in this third lesson, Learn from Adaptation and Survival concept. Those who love reading about plants might know that some plants hunt insects and feed on them. Yes, you heard it right, like this one. See? How it seems? It seems to have teeth. Insects are its main source of food. That's why its name is Venus flytrap. In Activity 6, Analyze Like Scientists, page 14, we will know more about plant adaptations. We will learn about plants' adaptations and whether plants actually have behavioral adaptations. We will also read two terrific trees, text together and analyze evidence about adaptation in both umbrella, acacia, and the kapok tree. Let's start with the acacia tree and then underline its environmental conditions, which means how the surrounding environment look. Secondly, its structural and behavioral adaptations that help it survive. Let's start reading and analyzing the umbrella acacia, page 14, and the first part on page 15. The umbrella acacia tree lives in the savanna. What problem does the plant face there? Although the weather is mild, it lacks water and drought threatens the plants there. What adaptation do the umbrella acacia use to survive in these environmental conditions? We will start with the structural adaptation. It's observed that umbrella acacia structure leaves, roots, and trunk. What do you observe in the leaves? Big or small? Your opinion, is there a link between the small size of the leaves and the lack of water? The smaller the leaves, the less water the plant loses, so it can endure drought. You know that the acacia root is named taproot and it grows deep downward. Let's see how it grows. Here is the soil, and the root goes deeply. The root of acacia tree goes deeply in the soil to search for the water. Why it happens? Why do you think? An environment which lacks water and the big deep root may be to find water deep down. Exactly, you are right. The deep root can absorb water that's found deep under the earth, like groundwater. Have you read in the text, the acacia tree is like camel hump? Do you remember what a camel hump does? It helps camels store water and fat. This is exactly what an acacia tree trunk does. It stores water. This means each part of the acacia structure helps it to endure the lack of water and drought. We know also that there are animals that will look for food and they may feed on the acacia tree leaves. But can they simply? Most of these organisms cannot even reach its leaves due to its great height. But giraffes may reach it. But can they eat the leaves? This is how the acacia tree leaves look like. You see what's surrounding it? Leaves are surrounded by sharp spines guarding the hungry mouth. But you may notice also another defensive way, which proves that the acacia really has behavioral adaptation. That's right. When an animal tries to eat the leaves of the acacia tree, it begins to produce poison that makes the leaves taste terrible. It then sends bad odor in the wind to acacia trees nearby, telling them to start making the same poison. We reached important results. Acacia has small leaves to prevent losing water, deep strong roots to find and search for water, and finally, the trunk stores water. But less water means less food for this environment animals that may want to eat this tree here. The acacia tree adapts to protect itself by surrounding its leaves with the spines and produce a poison and a bad odor that drives long animals away. Using the same way, let's analyze the kapok tree. Read carefully the rest of the text in page 15 and observe the images of the kapok tree. Then underline two things. Firstly, its environmental conditions. Secondly, its structural and behavioral adaptations that can help it survive. Let's start analyzing. The kapok tree is much longer than the plants around it, so it can get enough sunlight. Its leaves are hand-shaped like, which protect leaves from falling down easily. But how? The holes between the leaves allow wind move gently through the leaves. What evidence have you gathered about the kapok tree structural adaptation? It depends on wind to carry its fluffy yellow seeds across the forest. But why? What do you think? Where these seeds are spread across the forest and in soil, what would happen? More trees will grow, right? The kapok also invites bats to come through the scent of flowers carried by wind. But why bats? Remember what we read earlier in this unit's introduction? One last thing is that due to the rainy environment, its soil is soggy soil. I know. Let's look how its roots look like. The kapok tree stays firmly rooted thanks to the large white roots called buttress roots, even though they are not planted deeply in the ground. The roots begin high on its trunk, not deep to earth, like the acacia, as there is no need to go down seeking for water. Remember, there is always water. It needs what keeps it upright. That's why its root named buttress roots begin high on its trunk. We can sum up these results in these points. Soggy soil with difficulty for plants to reach the sun. The kapok tree adapts to this by its buttress roots, higher length, and leaves that use wind to spread seeds across the forest. The way in which we have analyzed these two trees can be applied to any plant, and you will find it easy as we didn't just memorize information. We used scientist skills to analyze, ask questions, think, and link information together. Now, I'm sure you're ready to think like botanists in our next step. In Activity 7, Think Like a Scientist, in which we will build upon what we learned about structural and behavioral adaptations in plants. Observe a group of various images of plants to collect evidence on adaptations that help plants to survive in their environments. Let's think of the first plant environment, mangrove trees. Mangrove trees lives in salt water. Anyone knows what's mangrove? A mangrove tree is a botanical gathering that's found in ocean water and is a little close to beach. Ocean usually have strong waves, especially at the time of tide. Think of what helps mangrove trees to survive against the strong waves. The second plant is water lilies. Water lilies grow in swamps. What conditions does this plant face? Swamps are covered with water all the time. If we think like botanists, the first question is, how is it rooted in water? Which part of its structure helps it to get enough light? The third plant is palm trees that lives in the desert. What information do you have about the conditions in the desert environment? Exactly, there is no water available easily, and the temperature is very high. Which part of the palm tree structure help it survive? Also remember that animals will try to look for anything to eat because of the lack of available food. So think about how plants in the desert might protect themselves from being fed by animals. Now to the fourth plant, the pine trees. The pine trees lives in the environment, as you see, covered with snow. What challenges does this plant face? Low temperature, a lot of snow falls in its branches and may press and break them. Water is not available easily in extreme cold periods. Now think about how the structure of the pine tree helps it to endure such conditions. The fifth image is the image of acacia trees in the savanna forests that we talked about in the last activity, and we knew that the environment is dry and the water is low, and all that you need to remember is how leaves, roots, and the trunk help it to endure such conditions. The last image with us is of the barberry fig plant that lives in the desert environment. Like the palm tree, look closely at this plant. You will notice something that might be the answer to a question: how the plant could protect themselves in the desert from being eaten by an animal. Now, it's your turn, botanists, to use all the observation and ideas that we have discussed in order to record your answers in page 17, where you will find a table with 6 plants written in it. Record in front of each plant its various structural adaptation and write in front of them how they help them in the environments where the plant lives. Think about the structure of the plant in terms of leaves, roots, stem, and trunk. You will also find a guideline answer for 2 plants to help you. Take your time, and after you finish, we will review with one another and share some of the answers that my students wrote. The answer model in the book says that the palm tree has thick roots and narrow leaves. How do you think this helps it? My students wrote that thick roots absorb water from down deep, and the narrow leaves help them to prevent water loss. You may also think that it has a strong trunk to endure the wind and not to be easily broken. As for the pine tree, it's triangle in shape, and its leaves have spikes, and its branches are short. And when we thought about connecting this to the fact that the environment is full of snow, snow slides easily of the triangle shape of this tree, so branches do not break. Unlike the acacia tree, where the snow would accumulate on the branches and it would break off because of the heavy weight. And since the environment doesn't have much water, the needle-shaped leaves would help the plant to avoid losing water. What about the mangrove tree? The mangrove trees, as observed by my students, have tangled and thick roots that help it hold against the water movement in water. What about water lilies? Water lilies, my students observed that leaves shape is wide, which helps the plant to float and soak up a lot of sunlight. And since it lives in water, long roots will help the plant to hold against the water movement. The acacia tree. The acacia tree is for sure easy to you. As to my students, as you analyzed and recorded your observations on its structural adaptation, in Analyze Like a Scientist activity, students observed about barberry fig that its spines make it hard for animals to eat. Let's now discuss questions in page 18 under Think about the activity. I'll give you time to think and then we'll share with you, my students, answers. The first question is, what are some characteristics of plants that help them survive? One of my students noticed differences in characteristics, like the shape and size of leaves, the way in which roots grow deep, as in the acacia tree, or up, like the kapok tree. All of them help plants to survive. Let me know if you remember any other characteristics in plants' structure. The second question is, compare and contrast the adaptation of plants to their environments. How are they the same? How are they different? Ahmad wrote that roots, leaves, and stems are common parts of plants, but shape and size may differ according to the environment. Surely you agree with Ahmad, and you can also write examples explaining this answer. The third question is, what would happen if plants were placed in different environments? This is one of my favorite questions. Imagine if there was a plant in a desert environment which was moved to a humid environment full of water, or vice versa. A plant grows in a desert environment to an environment full of snow. What will happen? I think you could guess the answer easily. If a plant were placed in a different environment, it would struggle to adapt. This is of course because its structure is not suitable for the environment in which it's present. Such as if we moved the kapok tree to a dry environment, because its roots are not deep in the earth and it will have a great difficulty absorbing water. This leads us to our last task in activity 8. Evaluate like a scientist. In Evaluate Like a Scientist, we will evaluate our knowledge about adaptations in different plants and how they help them to survive their environmental conditions. Also, we will practice communicating scientific information in written form. In page 19, we need to look at the two images and explain how those plants may have structural adaptation that help them survive in their environment. Look closely at the two images and do not forget to think about the environment. Let's go step by step. Look closely at the two images. You have to think about the parts of each plant and think about the shape of their environment. In the image to the right, we can see exactly desert. Do we know about plants living in it? Long roots to absorb most of the water from the depth of the earth, and spines to protect themselves from any animal trying to eat them. So, in writing notes, I'll state that the plant has long roots to absorb most of the water and spines to protect themselves from any animal because it lives in the desert environment. In the second image, we will see clearly that water is abundant because there is plenty of plants. Here we are up to the end of this lesson. Today we learned about structural and behavioral adaptations in plants and the importance of thinking in environmental conditions surrounding the plants when studying the adaptation. And most importantly, we applied the behavior of scientists in 3 activities: analyze like a scientist, think like a scientist, evaluate like a scientist. And these skills helped us explore interesting information about how plants use adaptations to survive. In our next lesson time, you will explore human and animal body and how our body systems adapted to meet the needs of living things. How is this related to adaptation? Wait for the next time to know. Thanks.